The exciting segment, a big debate with a crafted title, Is Islamic Finance in Control of Its Own Destiny? This session is exclusively brought to you by Oz Ahmed. With the House to propose the motion for today, Islamic finance needs a radical change to live up to its expectations. For that, I wish to invite our fellow debaters. First, Mr. Rafi Hanif, Chief Executive Officer, Group Transaction Banking and CIMB Foundation. Mr. Mokhtar Hussain, ASB Board of Governors. Dr. Mohammed Ashraf Iqbal, CPIF Chairman, Wafi Bank. Last but not least, Dr. Ala Alabid, Chartered Member of the Chartered Institute of Islamic Finance Professional, CIFF. Our moderator for the session, this debate, is Dr. Imran Loom, Director of Islamic Finance, National Australia Bank. Let us give another round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan salam sejahtera. Berehat sebentar di pohon cemara. Awal bismillah, pembuka bicara. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. مرحبا بكم في هذه المناقشة الهامة جدا. هل التمويل الإسلامي مسيطر تماما على مصيره? Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to this great debate on is Islamic finance in control of its destiny? And who better to debate this than absolute giants of the industry? We have Dr. Ashraf Iqbal, Dr. Ala Al-Abid, Mokhtar Hussain, and Rafi Hanif. So as mentioned, we'll be having an Oxford-style debate, and the motion is Islamic finance needs a radical change to live up to its expectations. Now in the red corner, we have the dream team of Dr. Ala and Dr. Ashraf. Dr. Ala has a PhD in Islamic finance from INSEAD, and she's a qualified chartered Islamic finance professional. Now she has won the Presidential Award not only once, but twice. And she has a Bachelor's of Commerce and Finance from Macquarie University and has previously worked with that group of companies and is part of RFI Foundation's Emissary Steering Group, advocating for ESG, and also working group member of AOFI. Now, Dr. Ashraf Iqbal is the founder of Mindspring, whose tagline is empowering minds and unleashing potential. No doubt he'll be talking about unleashing Islamic finance potential here today. He's currently the chairman of Wafi Bank and is the Sharia Committee member of HSBC Amana. He has a bachelor's in mechanical engineering, a master's in business administration, and a PhD in Islamic finance. Now in the blue corner, we have green, mashallah, green. In the green corner, we have the pioneers of Islamic finance, Rafi Hanif and Mokhtar Hussain. Rafi Hanif is the CEO of CIMB's Group Transactional Banking and the CEO of CIMB Foundation. Rafi has more than 2 decades of experience, previously being the CEO of CIMB Islamic, CEO for Malaysia of HSBC Amana, the regional head of Islamic Banking Asia Pacific at Citigroup, and the global head of Islamic finance at ABN AMRO in Dubai. He holds law degrees from International Islamic University and the Harvard Law School. Mokhtar Hussain. Now, bro, I'm sorry, I had to shorten this because if we were to read your whole bio, there'll be no room for discussion. So CEO of Montague Advisory Partners, board member of HSBC Amana and the Asian School of Business. Mokhtar has retired from HSBC as Group General Manager after a 39-year career at the firm, after a series of senior executive management roles in Asia, the Middle East and Europe. So the format for today will be each speaker will have 10 minutes. There'll be another 5 minutes for rebuttal and final remarks, and then we'll open up to question time. Now, I just want to pre-warn you that it is question time, So please just state your name and shoot out a question, inshallah. And after that, the voting will be done on Slido. So if you haven't already, I think they're going to shoot up a QR code. So when they shoot up the QR code, please scan the QR code and you can vote for the motion. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Ala to open the debate.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala ashraf al-khalq al-mursaleen Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi al-tayyibin al-tahirin wa sahbihi al-muntajabin. Assalamu alaikum and a very good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the organizers for this opportunity. It's really good to be back in KL, attending GIF and seeing you in person after so many years. If I may start, I'd like to touch on a few issues that, in my opinion, are central to our deliberations today. So before attempting to answer the question of whether or not Islamic finance is in control of its own destiny, it's just worth recalling what destiny are we expected to achieve should we follow the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our mu'amalat and financial dealings. So based on verse 275, of course, of Surah Al-Baqarah, a financial system that is based on the joint conditions of al-bay' and no riba, and one that observes the prescribed economic rules of behavior, is expected to foster financial inclusion and inclusive economic growth. It is also expected to instill financial stability. This is expected to be achieved through reducing leverage and maintaining a close link between the real and financial sectors of the economy. And of course, this is also to be done through upholding those universal values of equity, participation, property rights, and prudent, sustainable consumption and production. Having said that and painted a picture of where the destiny would be if we are to be in compliance with the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's useful to say and state where we are now. So if we are to take an account of current state of affairs, we can see that with more than 2.3 trillion of banking assets, the Islamic financial system is dominated by Islamic banks. Now, banking in general is a multi-stakeholder industry with different groups in control. So, of course, we have the regulators, but we also have rating agencies, law firms, accounting, insurers, all of whom have a say in the industry and all of whom have different management and incentive systems. Of course, Islamic banks have an additional layer of accountability to Sharia boards and their clientele, the Sharia-conscious investors and consumers. Of course, one cannot deny the fact that the present formation of Islamic banking has grown out of conventional banking and uses many of its techniques and instruments. It operates under the realm of modern financial architecture, an architecture that is based on fractional reserve system and deposit insurance schemes. This is the same deposit insurance scheme and fractional reserve system that is deeply rooted in repeated violations of deposit contract and use, or rather abuse, of debt contract, which culminated in the evolution of the current regulatory system. Of course, scholarly efforts have for long marked and linked the connection between fractional reserve system, leverage, credit booms, and crises. So during periods of stability, banks' high leverage strategies tend to contribute to a buildup of debt in the economy, inflate bubbles, and create a de-linkage between the real and the sectors of economy. These same bubbles, inflated by the debt creation dynamics of the banking industry, tend to aggravate crises once they hit. So one may wonder, what's the fault with seemingly innocent, well-intended deposit insurance schemes? Well, these deposit insurance schemes are at fault of misaligning risk and reward. So what they do, by providing that layer of limited liability, they create a condition whereby banks are able to reap the full upside of risky transactions, whereas the downside is limited due to the coverage, the insurance coverage. And that means that those who stand to benefit from the full upside are covered on the downside, and creates an incentive to assuming risks and indebtedness levels that are beyond the optimal level, which is in the maslaha or in congruence with the society's best interest. So from the time of Roman classical jurists up until now, there has been numerous calls for full reserve banking. A number of proposals have been put forward, and these proposals, of course, are very much in line with the spirit of Islamic finance. So what would be expected of something that's in line with the spirit of Islamic finance and in line with the tenets and the contracts of Islamic law? We would expect, of course, a full reserve banking to be there in order to meet and to back the demand deposits that are there. Whereas we would expect the fractional reserve system to be abolished for the maintenance of investment accounts. So that would mean that the depositors who are depositing on an on-demand basis should be expected to have access instantaneously to their funds, whereby they should be also willing to receive no monetary compensation in return. On the other hand, we would expect the Islamic investment account holders to be fully sharing the upside and downside of their transactions, of their accounts, in congruence with Islamic legal maxims and the recent calls actually by modern finance theory for the inseparability between risk bearing and profit and loss entitlement. This same proposal would also weaken, of course, the rationale for deposit insurance. It is clear, therefore, the role of regulation in not only shaping the incentives and creating the incentives for the market players, but also shaping their behavior. Therefore, the uniform application of conventional regulatory system to both conventional and Islamic banks in dual banking system unintentionally misalign the incentives and limit Islamic banks from fully operating and living up to their expectations and their potential. And it doesn't stop here. So the small incentives and this debt favoritism is not really unique to regulation. It rather permeates in all aspects of the modern banking and finance. So it's there in taxation, it's there in accounting, it's there in the bankruptcy and solvency laws. If we are to add to that the fact that there is a focus on creating products that appeal to a wider group of customers and the process of reverse engineering conventional products to meet the no riba condition of Islamic finance, then what we end up with is an industry that mimic to a great extent the economic implications of the conventional counterpart in which it is hosted, one which is inherently unstable and perpetually distortive. So in other words, and if we are to ask ourselves, what is it that we have been able to achieve in these 50 years of modern Islamic banking revival in history, then we can really say that we have successfully achieved an asset class within the conventional banking and finance, which is predominantly debt-based conventional finance, and one which have been successful in providing access to finance to a class of consumers who were Sharia conscious and of course were out of the financial system because of the conflict between their beliefs and their and the existent financial services. But beyond that, and one of course which has done so across and beyond OIC member countries over the course of the 50-year modern history. And we've also achieved commercial significance on operations to the point of being recognized as a systemically important industry in Asia and Middle East by the International Monetary Fund. And Islamic standard setters such as the KL headquartered IFSB and Bahrain headquartered IOFI had also yielded close cooperation with conventional standard setters. So these are all achievements that the Islamic banking and finance has managed to achieve over the course of recent history. However, Islamic finance needs a radical change to live up to its expectations and reverse motion towards debt-fueled and crisis-prone trajectory. So Islamic finance really needs to transcend forms. Failure to act now threatens to not only undermine the integrity of Sharia compliance industry, but also its contribution to financial stability, financial inclusion, and socioeconomic justice. The trust-intensive nature of the industry would amplify the failure of a handful of institutions to the whole industry. In fact, the overwhelming majority of empirical studies that have looked at different aspects of conventional vis-à-vis Islamic bank from a profit dynamic, risk, and stability angles have all concluded that there is no significant difference between Islamic and conventional banks today. Of course, change doesn't occur in vacuum. Reform is needed, and it must be informed by the longer-term perspective offered in the lessons of historical precedent, particularly regarding the fallibility of well-intentioned regulations and awareness of the detriment of and the danger of non-action. Of course, the full spectrum of necessary reform is not something with which fiqh, Sharia scholars, or regulators are to be overburdened with alone. It really requires all of us, each and every individual of us, to contribute to that change. Thank you.
Oof, yes salam, yes salam. Shots fired. All right, and who better to respond than Mukhtar?
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Imran. Great pleasure to be back here in KL with all of you. What I'd like to do for the green corner is perhaps address more specifically some of the practical realities we as practitioners have faced in this debate around whether Islamic finance is in control of its destiny and whether it needs to do something radical. So perhaps if I may begin, for those of us who were here this morning, we heard Tansri Azman recite some basic stats on the size of the Islamic finance industry. And essentially what he said was, we're kind of 1% of the entire universe. And 1% may seem very small, but in the context of an industry that's essentially 50 years old, that's quite a lot of progress in a relatively short period of time. But there's clearly an opportunity to significantly grow that number over the years ahead. One of the things I would observe is that, often when we look at numbers, we're actually looking at asset numbers. And perhaps something that we pay less attention to or are increasingly paying more attention to is that the opportunity in Islamic finance is not defined by assets alone. It's defined by liabilities and how to manage those liabilities to the benefit of the consumers. And that's something that we probably need to spend much more time on. As somebody who spent much of their career in a global financial institution, one of the things that you learn to do is you learn the art of negotiation. You understand that, often issues are not driven by principles alone, but they're driven by practicalities. People look at data, they look at specific metrics, and they look to see whether the proposition that you have before you is one that makes economic sense. So if, Imran, you'll indulge me, for a few minutes, let me take you through some hardcore realities that when we talk about Islamic finance, not in the aspirational context of wanting to see the industry grow, but the operational context of how does the industry grow within the confines of the global industry that we have. So look, what I would say to those that strongly support the ideal of converting the financial system to being more Islamic than it is, I would say that that's highly acceptable. In fact, it's exactly the right thing to do. But remember, idealism has a place, but the reality of idealism is it needs to meet realism. And then that realism needs to be translated into practical and pragmatic steps that transfer that idealism into some form of commercially sustainable reality. So, we can talk as much as we like about frameworks, we can talk about aspirations and ideals, we can talk about desirable objectives, but within all of that, we've got to have a framework that delivers and translates that into an operational reality. So here are a few of the things that if you were navigating this journey with somebody who'd never heard of Islamic finance or had never understood its fundamental tenets, as Dr. Allah has so articulately put forward, one of the first things that any organization will look at is something called market share, right? It's as simple as, explain to me why, what you're putting forward is either going to enhance my market share, or if I choose to do nothing, will erode my market share, or at the end will create market share. Because that is a measurement of my relevancy in that particular commercial context. If you're a commercial organization, market share is the statistic that interests you. And it interests you in two contexts. Either you're a price maker or you're a price taker. If you're a price taker, essentially you haven't got enough leverage in the market to dictate structure or price or outcome. Essentially, you're a follower. And in many of the markets where we have seen Islamic finance grow, Islamic finance started very much as being the price taker. Over time, as Islamic finance grew in scale, it grew through both commercial activities, regulatory sponsorship, consumer buy-in. It became larger and larger in scale. And when it became larger in scale, it then began to command its own destiny in terms of innovation, in terms of products, in terms of structures. So this market share argument may appear somewhat isolated when you think about it just as one component, but actually it's a fairly fundamental component of most commercial organizations. The second part of that is that, look, ultimately commercial organizations become sustainable if the profitability from that particular endeavor sustains. So the return on equity, the return on investment is something that, Madam CFO or Madam CEO is going to ask you about. Where is the return coming from this business? And so, in fact, both of these things go together. You've got to drive market share, you've got to drive profitability to actually create sustainability, to create scale so that you can create market impact. And I don't think we can go away from those commercial realities. If we do go away from those commercial realities, what I would suggest is then this becomes a passion project. Because if it's not economically sustainable, somebody's going to have to underwrite the cost of keeping it going. And actually, there are few people who underwrite costs for decades. And if we're building an industry, often we're talking about quite a long period of time. So this is something that's quite important. Secondly, if you look at the concept, perhaps from a slightly different point of view, how do you create disruption in an industry? So, is Islamic finance going to displace conventional finance in one single leap of faith? Well, the answer practically is it would be nice to think that it could, but actually in realism, it can't. It's going to have to work alongside the conventional industry whilst it grows and scales and sophisticates and develops propositions to the point where it can compete and to the point where it can then dominate in a particular marketplace. There is a pragmatism to that. I think that's exactly what we've seen over the last decade or so in Islamic finance, and certainly Malaysia and other countries here are to be congratulated for the work that's been done in laying the framework that's created the momentum for Islamic finance in this part of the world, because that's been an inspiration to what's happened in the Middle East and elsewhere. So I think what we've really got to try and do is understand what is it that would create disruption? What is it that creates an opportunity for Islamic finance to flourish? And perhaps there are two key driving factors that come to my mind in that regard. One is innovation. The simple fact is no industry can really develop or scale or become relevant without creating a level of innovation that creates a consumer impact which is irresistible. And we've seen that in other industries. We've seen that happen with the digitalization initiatives across the globe. Islamic finance has to find that innovation. Some of us sitting here were involved with the world's first sovereign sukuk issue, which my learned friend to my left, Rafi, led with distinction, which was essentially the first time that the government of Malaysia went to the market to create an asset, which then became an asset class in its own right. So that's becoming incredibly important. Innovation is the key. Secondly, align innovation with execution. It's no good talking about a good idea. It's actually implementing a good idea. So if Islamic finance can combine innovation with execution and create new asset classes that then begin to dominate categories of finance, just in the same way sukuks, for example, now are a very important component of the global bond universe. That's really important. I think I've talked about market analytics, so I won't go through that again, but I think the final comments, if I may, would be to say that, look, we've got to develop an ecosystem that supports and facilitates the growth of Islamic finance. I think, Allah, you talked about the fact that we've got to have institutions and structures. Perhaps many of the accounting rules that we have today don't really support equity-based finance. And for debt-based institutions, equity financing rules are penal. And it's something that we really do need to look at in conjunction with regulators, accounting agencies, and ratings agencies. Last but not least, there are now developments globally that allow Islamic finance to be seen in a broader lens as being perhaps a major component form of ethical finance. Islamic finance and ethical finance go hand in hand together. And I think the urge towards sustainable finance gives Islamic finance a huge opportunity to provide its capabilities to issuers and investors alike. And going back to my earlier point on liabilities, I think there's a massive demand for liabilities that are going to be created for those people who can come up with Islamic products that serve the green market. So our contention is that Islamic finance may not be able to control its entire destiny, but there are certain elements of its destiny that it is in control of. And actually, this is a journey of many steps. There's no eureka moment where Islamic finance replaces conventional finance, but there are many steps to Islamic financing becoming a bigger component of the financial services universe, providing more choice and more economic and social justice to the consumers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mukhtar, for that dose of realism there. And now, to take it a few notches, the guru himself, Dr. Ashraf.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mukhtar, thank you very much for the enlightenment, and it was definitely a good education in Islamic finance. I shall start with a short mukaddimah, followed by a statement, and then I'll make two assertions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in His infinite wisdom and mercy, gave us a set of rules on how we should organize society. He gave us this in a book He Himself called the Furqan. And He even gave us the reason why we needed this Furqan. Because He says, if the truth had been in accord with their desires, man's desires, truly the heavens and earth and all beings therein would have been in confusion and corruption. Nay, we have sent them the admonition, but they turn away from their admonition. 2371. So Allah explains. He tells us this, right? The Quranic view is that man is born free and he is only enslaved to his Creator. Life on this earth serves as a test for the hereafter, was never meant to be a bed of roses. Nonetheless, every man is entitled to live with dignity. Whilst there are many ways to organize society, the one way that Islam draws a line at is to organize it on the basis of debt. Debt is to be only incurred sparingly, when necessary, and to be repaid as soon as possible. Not surprisingly, the longest ayat in the Quran is the ayat with regards to debt. The current mode of organizing society is antithetical to that of the Quran. It is a system designed to enslave people through debt. The material accomplishments of this debt-based system mask the neuroticism, dehumanization, and destruction of society and the planet. For Islamic finance to be in control of its destiny, it must not be measured by how much more debt it is able to create, but instead it must be measured by how much debt it can remove from the system. My statement: practical, reality, idealism. If Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam took the reality about having to slaughter his son, if the Prophet Muhammad salam went into Badr against the reality of what he was facing, we would not have Islam today. Islam is a religion that's organized on faith, whatever the realities may be. The Prophet ﷺ said, you put the sun in my right hand and you put the moon in my left hand, I'm still not going to compromise on your way. That's the position of Islam. The two assertions that I'm going to make. The first one, there is nothing fine or refined about the practice of conventional finance. And for as long as we are enamored by it and try to be like it, albeit in a Sharia-compliant manner, we will never be in control of our destiny. Assertion number two, to be in control of our destiny, we will require more than just a logical, rational mind. We're going to need more than just belief. We are going to require faith. Faith in Allah and faith in Allah's promise. Our crisis today is a crisis of yaqeen, not a crisis of belief. Let me start with the first of my two assertions. The battle between riba, or usury, and man's consciousness, its consciousness in our mind, is over. And usury has won hands down. Riba has won hands down. The battle went on for 3,300 years, starting in the Hindu text circa 1400 before Christ. And its final liberation was in 1823 by Cardinal Luzerne. And that's when riba broke free. Today, nobody talks about it or wants to talk about it, and in the West, most people don't even know the word or what it means anymore. If the West's criticism of Islam was that it was spread by the sword, then my criticism of the modern banking system is that it came about through deception and bloodshed. I say deception because the West, and here I mean those in Rome, Venice, Italy, the great trading centers of that time, had to contend with the church's absolute prohibition on riba. A growing class of specialists called the casuists and a very lucrative practice called casuistry emerged. These casuists were religious scholars who exerted their minds to use legal means to get around moral problems. In 1650, this practice was so prevalent that Blaise Pascal, the mathematician, said this, and I quote, "When the legal method is applied to a moral law, when you at the same time affirm the moral law to be divine and immutable while you are eviscerating it of its whole substance, you are playing fast and loose with morality itself." And we see this today in the UK. This is why, despite the proclamation that King Charles as the head of the Church of England, in the Church of England, marriage can only be between man and woman. But in law, anybody can marry anybody in any position in the UK today, despite its king being the head of the Church of England. This is the reality when we start to play around with the moral law. The second part, bloodshed. In 1290, the year 1290, the Jews were murdered and expelled in England for practicing riba. In 1527, Henry VIII goes to Rome. He puts the sword against the neck of the Pope and demands the creation of the Church of England. That's how the Church of England came about. And he had only two reasons for it. He wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn, and he wanted to legalize riba. Okay? And that is exactly what happened. You can today visit all of these old castles and manors. You can go down to Ely Castle, you can all of these places. And you will see the people who were murdered in the UK and the properties that were confiscated because they refused at that time to give their bay'ah to the Anglican Church. This is the history of it. Yeah? And yet, the entire world now looks at the West as the beacon of truth and the light of hope when it comes to banking. As elegantly stated by Guy Eaton, vice pays tribute to virtue by masquerading behind the mask of religion, and wickedness walks the street more confidently when dressed decently. Given that that history of conventional finance, as we so eloquently call it, what makes us think that it will capitulate now and embrace the spirit of Islam? Given, in fact, conventional finance today is more than ready to embrace Islamic finance. The early emerging threat of an alternative financial system that was to be built on principles of justice and fairness has now dissolved. They are now looking at Islamic finance and saying, welcome to the club. And the reason that they are pleased is because the most precious element of money, Rafi, you got a $10 note in there, you can show them, money. Yeah? Okay. That most precious, which is its fecundity, has been preserved. It is not being challenged, but instead has been accepted in Islamic finance as a basic truth. So what is this fecundity? We take something that is infertile, barren, and we give it the power to reproduce, to grow, to multiply. This is why in the 13th century, Dante wrote in Inferno, that was his play, the usurers are placed in the 7th level of hell. And who are with the usurers? The sodomites. And the reason the usurers are being placed with the sodomites in the 7th level of hell is because the sodomites turn a fertile egg barren, while the usurers turn a barren egg fertile. In Mokhtar's reality, the business of a bank is to make money from lending money. And it is problematic for us today as it was for the English in the 17th century. This debate we're having was the same they're having in the 17th century. And I quote, usury was not for the Elizabethans a pretty word or notion. It was also a complicated one. Though lending out one's money for one's own financial return was very difficult not to class as usury, it was still a tricky thing to define precisely, in part because so many inventive minds and ingenious practitioners had spent centuries trying to get around it, finding loopholes in the law. And so Thomas Gresham's pragmatism bumped up against one of the greatest taboo of the church and Christendom. Money was as necessary as it was problematic, and it was problematic because how it was made was under the scrutiny of God, and there was no escape. This is not a new debate. Now on to my second assertion. To be in control requires more than logical, rational mind and more than just belief. We are going to require faith. We're going to have to require faith in Allah and faith in Allah's promise. If you read that 2 verses on riba, right? 278, Allah says very simply, oh, you believe, fear Allah, give up what remains of your demand for usury. Riba is one of those words you don't have to make tawbad, you don't have to recompense the person, you just need to stop it. And then he says, if you do not take notice, it's a war from Allah. Not anything else, it's a war. That declaration of war is not punishment in the hereafter, that declaration of war is here. The hereafter, you stay in hell forever. All right? The declaration of war is here, and it's called global warming. And this is how Allah is fighting out the battle. What we're witnessing is anthropogenic destruction. Yeah? 30:41, Surah Ar-Rum. Corruption does appear on the land and sea because of the evil which man's hand have done. And he may make them taste a part of which they have done, in order that they may return to him. Putting more debt into the system isn't going to reverse this, because the only way the indebted can pay off those debts is to further monetize the earth. With global debt currently at 236% of global GDP, the interest or profit, whichever we call it, to service that debt currently is equivalent to the entire output of Japan. That's just the interest service cost currently. If Islamic finance is going to be in control, we radically need a new model, not to pump up more debt, but to mobilize capital to where it needs to get to. Capital must be tamed down to serve humanity. The world is not short of capital. The world is short on compassion, and the world is short of generosity. Deaf, dumb, and blind, they perceive not.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ashraf. Very, very sobering comments there. I feel he's declared war on all of us here tonight. But who better to come back than the lawyer himself, Rafi Hanif.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salam ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. It gives me great pleasure to be here among friends. I was rather surprised when I was invited for this debate. Many among the samurais here have seen me as a Ronin. So the fact that I was invited gives me great pleasure. And when I look at all these comments that have been made before, we seem to be in agreement on the destiny. The destiny is about ensuring Islamic finance is able to achieve social, economic, and environmental justice. And we strongly believe, and there's enough empirical data to support this belief, that the current form of banking, driven by fractional reserve banking, doesn't promote equitable, social, economic, and environmental justice. We have seen, and there's a lot of data done. Surprisingly, all this data is coming from Western institutions. If you look at the Roosevelt Institute, it has computed how much external cost of this current system. In the span of 10 years, the fractional reserve banking system that we have inherited has costed the US taxpayers $22.3 trillion. That's the endogenous cost that has not been factored into the pricing of debt that we offer today. Why that it is cheap? Interest rate seems benign, and debt financing seems attractive is because these external costs are borne by the society. So while we praise about this banking that has created so much wealth, it has also created so much suffering. And all these things have been recorded in great detail by Western institutions. The Schumacher Institute records the cost of financial intermediation to the environment. It runs into trillions. So the debate today is, what is our destiny? Our destiny is to create social, economic, environmental justice, and that necessarily requires us to unplug fractional reserve banking from the CPU and put in a new form of banking called what we call full reserve banking. So full reserve banking is not new. It's been around for almost 90 years. It first came through this plan called the Chicago Plan, which was presented to President Roosevelt within 10 days of him coming to office. That was his first plan. And the plan was quite simple. It was about creating a dichotomy between demand deposits and investment accounts, or investment trusts, as he will call it. And subsequently, there have been 6 other proposals, including the last one that was actually debated in a parliament, which is called the Sovereign Money Initiative in Switzerland. So before we come to this, I wanted to just highlight that we all seem to agree on the destiny. What my learned brother and mentor, Mukhtar has mentioned earlier, is that we have to take cognizance of the fact that it's not a direct flight to that destiny. This is a multiple stop flight. And the first step, he eloquently argued that it requires us to gain market share. Before we can have a seat on the table to engage on a reform proposal, you need to have a seat on the table. With 1% market share, though significant from a 50 years context, is not sufficient to have a voice, a strong voice to make a change, make a reform. So we need to make sure that the first stop before we can go to the final destiny is to gain market share. Alhamdulillah, we have about 40% market share in Malaysia, the same in the Middle East, and in other countries we are seeing the market share growing. Yes, the market share is growing through hybrid product offering. Ijara has become Ijara Muntahiyya Bitamlik, Murabaha become Murabaha Lil-Lamir Bil-Shira, and even deposits have now been based on Tawarruk. Yes, these are not ideal situations, but we have to bite the bullet to make sure that we're able to conform to the fractional reserve banking model. Trying to change fractional reserve banking model at this stage has failed, because this is what the Swiss were trying to do. We will explain that in a minute. The second part of the journey is, whilst we are engaging in this journey to gain market share through less than desirable products and services, we need to ensure that we don't do damage. So the concept of Amr Ma'ruf or Nahy al-Munkar requires us to, while we gain benefit through the advancement of this, what we call risk transfer, Islamic financing products and services, we have to ensure that we are not creating damage to the society and the environment. So the drive towards sustainable Islamic finance is the second leg of the journey. And the final leg of the journey, which may take 20 years, may take 50 years, is what the Swiss were trying to do in 2015. Now, this proposal came in 2015. If you remember, in 2015, there was an organization called MOMO, Modernizing Monetary System in Switzerland. They came up with this 10-page proposal where they said, and by the way, Switzerland is not only famous for chocolates and luxury watches, they are the banking capital of the world. More than 300 banks known for their solid banking regulations. And you'll be very surprised to see that this is the first reform proposal which is pretty much in line with Islamic principles. So the MOMO proposal was very simple. It said money that created by the sovereign must go back to the sovereign. So today, if you look at, you mentioned about 17th century, in 17th century England or Switzerland, the money in circulation were notes and coins minted by the sovereign. But today, if you look at Malaysia, money in circulation is only 5% of the money supply. So if you look at the Bank Negara report in 2013, it was 60 billion of M1. And if you include M2 and M3, the money supply created by the banks, it is $1.3 trillion. Can you imagine? It's only 5%. And the GDP in 2013 was 1 trillion. So the money supply was 300 billion higher than GDP. Fast forward at 2022, we find that 60 billion M1 has now increased to 146 billion. M3, the broad money, has increased to 2.2 trillion. And what's our GDP last year? 1.5 trillion. So the money supply keeps growing. So what does MOMO want? They want to stop that. Why they want to stop it? Because if you look at how money is created, we all believe that when the banks get deposit, we will then give a loan out. When what Bank of England has explained quite clearly on the website, the banks actually create deposit through lending. It's the other way around. So if you go to a bank and say, I want $1 million loan or financing, the bank will credit $1 million into your account. It's a current account. It's not cash they are depositing. It's an accounting treatment. So you have now 1 million to use for your goods and services. At the same time, the bank's deposit goes up by 1 million. So loan book goes up by 1 million, deposit book also goes up by 1 million. And you use that account to transfer money to buy a car. And the seller's bank account will then get $1 million from my account. So my account will be debited and his account will be credited. Net, the industry has increased the money supply by 1 million by the act of the bank giving me a loan of 1 million. Now this is what MOMO wanted to stop. They say this excessive money creation is infinite. You can create infinite amount of money supply that's going to drive the demand for goods and services. That will cause the systemic imbalance. The world is a finite resource. You can't keep exploiting this finite resource through the expansion of the money supply. So MOMO's intention is to stop and revert this money creation back to the sovereign. And this is literally a 10-page proposal, very simple to understand. All it says is, when they were looking at a 3-year transition period, and they said, when the transition starts, a bank balance sheet will look like this. You will have 100 billion worth of assets, loan book, which is backed by, say, 60 billion ringgit worth of current account and 40 billion worth of fixed deposits. It's a simple balance sheet. And MOMO was saying, the 60 billion will now be transferred to the central bank. The central bank will just give a loan, it's a loan note to the bank. So the bank balance sheet will now change liability deposit. Now liability is a loan to the central bank. You have to pay back the loan to the central bank. That 60 billion will now move from being a liability of the bank to an off-balance sheet item. And this exactly is what we wanted to do. If you look at the concept of of deposit, deposit today is acting as qard. And what the Swiss has done, they have elevated that qard into wadiya yad amana. It's a deposit held on trust. The second one, the 40 billion, which is fixed deposit, they basically said, look, change it into a risk-sharing deposit. What is a risk-sharing deposit? It's a mudaraba. They didn't have any Islamic terms, but the Swiss proposal is essentially Islamizing that. And how do they create new loans? They have to either borrow from the central bank for new funds, or they get more money from the risk-sharing investment account, or they issue a sukuk or a bond or issue equity. So this is as close as an Islamic proposal that came to the world, and it was declined. Why was it declined? When it went for referendum, 25% of the population voted in favor because you didn't have a bank sponsoring it. Momo is not a bank, it's an NGO. So that's why Mukhtar was arguing that the banks must have market share. That market share would allow you to bring this proposal to say, look, we now want to change the way banking is done. We need to move from fractional reserve banking to full reserve banking. There are more than 7 proposals, and Allah has highlighted that as well. All these proposals are effective. It can be done. It's just we don't have a political will to do it. So I think the journey is a three-step destiny, and we have control of the destiny. The first is we control by having the market share. Second is we control to make sure that we are sustainable from an economic, environmental, and social justice perspective. And the third one is get this proposal updated. There are a few weaknesses in this proposal. That proposal can be updated, and we then go out with a full implementation. I would like to end this quote with this quote. It's not from a holy source. It's from a musical play called Man of La Mancha. It's a musical play from an epic novel from the Spanish literature. So the protagonist, Don Quixote, was asked by a lady. He wanted to be a knight. And the lady asks him, what is your quest? And he says to the lady, my lady, my quest is to dream the impossible dream, to beat the unbeatable foe, to right the unrightable wrong, and if I must, to march into hell for a heavenly cause. And my ultimate quest, he said, is to reach the unreachable star. And I think that is our quest. With that, I leave.
Rafi, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I feel we're getting to the serious rounds now. You know, the gloves are pretty much coming off. Dr. Allah, I'd like to invite you to say a few final comments.
Thank you very much. I mean, just on what has been said about idealism and realism, I also wanted to quote, and this is a quote by the former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King. So he actually argues that there is a financial alchemy, and that the creation of extraordinary financial powers that defies reality and common sense. And that both the creation of money, paper, and banks that issue credit are, well, we take them as granted today, they're both core ideas, were revolutionary and almost magical.
That wisdom came to him after he retired as a central bank governor, not when he was a governor.
True, but now we have that wisdom presented to us on a platter. And then to the point on market share, I mean, I hear you, and this is why I quoted IMF as saying that Islamic banking has actually reached systemic importance in Asia and the Middle East. So which market are we trying to capture, really? And this is why I said that this reach and focus of us to really to gain acceptability by a wider group of audience, this is what has led us this far. But is that really the markets that we're intended to make sustainable? Is that our market, or are we really looking at a different market, the global market, whereas we're supposed to be serving Malaysia, for instance, OIC member countries? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Allah. Mukhtar.
I think the saying often goes, you know, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think we're living through times of crisis. And that crisis is financial, it's social, it's economic, it's environmental. And I think that affords us an opportunity to press the reset button, because so much of what's given cause to that crisis are things that we must remediate. But in the remediation of those problems, we create new opportunities. And that's what gives me a sense of renewed optimism about where Islamic finance can play a role. Because frankly, put the other way around, if everything was all hunky-dory and rosy, actually, why do we need Islamic finance? Everything is perfect, isn't it? Yeah? But now we have a problem. And the source of that problem needs diagnosis. It needs reform. And, don't forget, in Malaysia's own august history, you've done a very good job in looking at, let's say, the Asian financial crisis in 97, 98, and reforming very significant components of Malaysia through reform, through restructuring, through recapitalization, through consolidation. It led to a significantly stronger economy afterwards. So I would assert, Imran, that actually, now is a very good time, given the global backdrop that we've got, to allowing Islamic finance to flourish. And now to your question, I think, look, let it flourish and grow where it's got a natural opportunity to do so. And that really actually begins here in Asia and in the Middle East. If we can show that the system is working well there, then it will transport itself naturally elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Mukhtar. I almost feel scared passing on to Dr. Ashraf because I get the fear of Allah every time he speaks. Dr. Ashraf, please.
Ittaqullah. Unfortunately, I'm an engineer, and I see the world through the lens of an engineer. And as an engineer, the question that I ask is, why is it every other system that after it breaks down, the system gets safer, it gets better, right? So if you think about it, right, you think about airlines. The cars you drive has got a built-in factor of safety between 3 to 7. An airplane has only a factor of safety of 1.3, and yet the safest mode of travel is by air, right? So every crash they learn, they make the rules, it gets better. But the financial system works the opposite. Every time there's a crash, they make promises, and then the next one gets even worse, right? So if you don't believe, go read the BIS. What the Bank of International Statement said after the 2008. Oh, we've made it better, we've made it safer, bullshit. Right? Because as Mokhtar says, we're sitting in that crisis right now. And the reason the system is hard to change is because we are addicted to debt. It is an addiction. As Rafi says, right? Imagine if I went to any bank and said, I want to borrow $1 million, but don't open my savings account, deposit it straight to the other bank. You think they're going to let me do it? No way, right? Because that's how it starts. And we are addicted to that, which is why the Quran places this huge emphasis on the rules about that. And it's not that we do not know how to move forward. Rafi has articulated how to move forward. Mokhtar has articulated how to move forward. Allah has articulated. In Switzerland, we had WIR Bank, Weir Bank in Switzerland. They were interest-free. Everything that's in the report, all the way up to 1952. Right? You got Jacks Mendel's Bank in Sweden that started post-World War II until today, riba-free. Right? 100% reserve requirement in their model. You've got Aussie Farmers Mutual. So we've got all these examples around us that are not within the Islamic sphere, but doing things completely Islamic. The question is why? Why is it so difficult? Why is it so difficult? And for this, and that's my final comment, the answer is in 268 Al-Baqarah 268. Allah tells us the reason why we will find it so hard to change. And what he says is, the devil threatens you with the prospect of poverty and bids you to the shameful deed of stinginess, while Allah promises you forgiveness and great bounties from Him. And Allah is all bountiful, all knowing. So every time we want to do this, but we don't have the market share, and if we do this, the whole world's going to come to us, and we're going to be hungry, and it's going to be poverty. Yeah, that's the shaitan whispering. If you want to do this, we're going to do it, and I go back to my opening saying, you're going to have to do it with yakin. You have to do it in faith, lillahi ta'ala. because we're all going to die. See, God, you don't understand God. You know what? Is that what you're going to tell Allah? Right? You're going to die, you're going to face Allah. See, Allah, we didn't have the market share, so you got to understand. Ladies and gentlemen, I guarantee you, they said two certainties of life was death, taxes and death. Based on what's happening in Malaysia, taxes also not a certainty, but death. But death remains that certainty, and we are all going to be responsible to answer for our deeds. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ashraf. Thank you. Rafi, please.
I think the main takeaway for me is that since we know the ultimate destiny and is quite clear, and many attempts have been made from the Chicago plan, followed by what you call narrow banking, and then you have the positive money organization, you have limited purpose banking by Kotlikov, you have what you call the Iceland Sovereign Money Initiative. So there are about 7 proposals over a span of 90 years. How many proposals have come from the Islamic world? So I've been discussing with ISRA and INCF that we should come up with our proposal. It reminds me of what Maulana Rumi said, what you seek is seeking you. And we're still debating on how to make Tawarruk more efficient. Of course, that's good, it grows the market share. But in terms of reality on the ground, we have not been able to put an intellectual proposal saying these are the weaknesses. And even then, I strongly believe, however good the proposal is, it won't fly. Unless you have market share. Market share means you must be in a dominant position. You cannot be 5% market share and say, look, I want to change your structure, right? So you got to be on the dominant market share and say, look, while we are building the dominant market share, the intellectuals in the Muslim world must come up with a proposal. I've yet to see any serious discussion on how to unplug the CPU and replace with the full reserve banking. Because the full reserve banking is in line with Islamic principles. Because the moment you take demand deposit out and say, is this wadiya yad amana, what is left is basically investment account. Now, in this model, they are operating the investment account on debt again, because they don't have a better alternative. But the moment you take fractional reserve banking out and you take away deposit insurance, you take away lender of last resort, you take away the tax benefit. By the way, the tax rebate costs the GDP 3 to 5%. Huh? That is what the GDP would have got if you have take away the tax rebate. Now, we are losing 5% of our GDP to make debt cheaper. And what has the debt growth cost us? Every year we're seeing property prices going up. And this is what Al-Ghazali mentioned. By creating this money supply, you are debasing the currency. What you could have bought 10 years ago, you probably could buy a quarter of that. So the debasement of the currency is a natural progression of the money supply growth. And every economist know it. But they're not able to change it because, as Chuck Prince said, you have to continue dance until the music stops. Although at that time, music has stopped. He didn't realize it. So what I'm saying is, we know the destiny, we know the journey. We need to believe that we have control of that destiny. Today we have control because we are seeing market share growing. We have control on the second part of the destiny because we can make our tawarruk and our hybrid Islamic financing to be more sustainable and economically equitable. The third one is where I feel that we need to do a lot more work if we want to be in control of the third part of the destiny. So I strongly believe that we are in control of the destiny and we have to continue moving to make sure that we meet the ultimate destiny, which is the unreachable star. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you've heard from 4 amazing speakers, pioneers in the industry. We're going to open up to question and answer time, but may I just remind you that it is question and answer time, not speech time. So all I want is I would like your name and a short, sharp question. Thank you very much. So we'll be taking also, if you want to, we'll be taking some online as well. So I promised Safri, if he's in the audience. He's there? Safri. Oh, there he is. Okay, Safri for the first question, please. Okay, last one. Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much. It was indeed a wonderful treat to, listen all of you. Really, really incredible. I have a very specific question to Mr. Mukhtar and Mr. Rafi. As you were explaining the difference and, in fact, the challenge between the realism versus the idealism, and you very rightly said that we are being followers in the industry, but at the same point in time, the challenge is we have to increase the market share as well. So since we are increasing the market share and we are really small compared to the size of the industry, how in fact we can be in control of our destiny while tackling with that?
Look, I think that market share and destiny are not incompatible, right? Because often the journey starts with recognizing where the market is going and what kind of share you want within that market. And then what are the kind of levers that you have to get market share, whether it's an asset product or it's a liability product? Where specifically does the journey take you? And I think that's where I think you have to be very careful about the choices that you make, because there may well be some areas of the market which, frankly, others dominate, right? And it would be futile for you to compete in that area because you'll never get the scalability to allow you to be effective. So I think it's really a question about informed choices around where you have a competitive right to win, which may be based on a product proposition, it may be based on something geographical, it may be based on a packaging approach towards certain items. Once you define that journey and you follow it over a period of time, you'll achieve some level of scalability. I think the other thing is that, in the modern era with digitalization and innovation, I think your ability to disintermediate the classic structures of branches and processes and procedures, the ability to onboard and deliver clients' propositions almost immediately, changes the timeline to that reality quite quickly. But I think it is a question of focus and execution.
Thank you very much.
I just want to add on to that. I want you all to think about this. Don't answer the question thinking, who is the leader in electric car today? And how much market share did they have 5 years ago? Just think and answer that question in your mind. And that's the rebuttal to Mark Mokhtar's position.
Thank you. Ustaz Dawood.
Thank you. A very, very, Dowd Vickery, unattached, retired. I think that's right. Excellent quality of debate, and I'm delighted about the quality. It's Thursday, and on Thursdays I have breakfast with Pak Mus, who was the man who brought me into Islamic finance more than 3 decades ago. And I told him about this debate, and he said, ask this question. So it's not my question. He says, when they finished speaking, ask them this question. What are you going to do to change this? The first action you take once you leave the stage to move this forward. Great debate. I think we're all on the same page, but it's about the action you take. So I'd like to hear from each panelist, what do you do about it right now?
We've taken a license in Labuan. The bank is called Wafi Bank, and we're going to run the bank on the basis of 100. The Wafi team is over there. And it's going to operate on a 100% reserve requirement. That's the first thing we're going to do.
I think the simple answer to a very significant question is not to dream, but to do. And the do part is what's within the realm of my own responsibility. Who are the stakeholders I can influence? What's the level of conviction power that I can bring to take forward that argument? What can I do to defend and promote what Islamic finance can do so that actually, I'm an enabler of people understanding why it's got a role to play going forward. I think the great danger with the industry is that there's too much debate and not enough delivery. And frankly, we're all judged by delivery.
Thank Thank you. I mean, David, I think the one thing that we have attempted to achieve today was really creating that awareness. So, I mean, that would be our first action that we have taken today. I mean, just the awareness that we're trying to create here. And inshallah, we can also make a difference and hopefully invest in sustainability and bring about sustainable products, inshallah. Thank you.
My humble comment is that we have to wake up and smell the coffee. If you look at what happened in 1933, the worst of economic crisis, the Great Depression, Roosevelt just came to power. And the first thing he did was declare a bank holiday because it would have just turned into a spiral. And the first proposal he gets is the Chicago Plan. And it was perfect. And if you look at if you look at the correspondence, he was very much in favor. But he couldn't implement it despite the banking sector coming down to its knees. That was the most optimal point. And you realize when there is this kind of a shock to the system, people go back to their fitrah, the natural law to do the right thing. And you found these economists, like Irving Fisher, a week before the crisis was saying that, look, the stock market has reached its permanent plateau, that it will be always a boom. And the next week, the market crashed, and he lost his entire investment. So these are the people who converted and basically said, look, we need to change. And they had a two-window model, a Wadia model and an investment trust model. But yet, FDR had to compromise. He came up with a deposit insurance scheme. FDIC was born out of that. And he was not a proponent of deposit insurance. He thought he was going to create a moral hazard. But the banking lobby was still so strong. So that's why it's really important. While we really want to see more success on this niche, to get mainstream relevance, I strongly believe you need to be on the driving seat. That's why the market share strategy is really important to pursue. And that's what we want to do. We will grow Islamic banking to make sure that it becomes the dominant market share.
Thank you, Rafi. Yes, Doctora.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, a very lively debate. I would like to pose one question to the red team and then one question to the green team. I hope I'm allowed to do that. First one, I would like to sort of challenge the conclusion made by Dr. Ashraf Iqbal earlier with regards to debt. I think it's not really accurate to say that debt is abhorrible or something which is not allowed in Islam, because I have never understood Islam as prohibiting debt. But what I understand is the prohibition of riba on debt transaction, and that will actually eliminate the kind of debt which is abusive of the borrower. So I hope your comment on that. And a question to the green team, you are talking about market share, but to some extent I would like to know the limit that you are putting, because my fear is you are so engrossed in getting a market share that perhaps your own principles have been diluted. How do you know that you are now not crossing the limit and that the persons who are pursuing to get to the same destiny become disillusioned with what you are doing? So that's a question that I want to know from you in terms of the limits and how you balance between your principle and the market current that can actually sway you against your principle. Thank you.
Thank you. Two amazing questions. Dr. Ash, you want to start?
So the good thing of having written out my notes is I can quote exactly what I said. And I know I did not say debt was prohibited. All right, so let me quote. While there are many ways to organize society, the one way that Islam draws a line at is to organize it on the basis of debt. Debt is a humiliation and a means of enslavement that is to only be incurred sparingly where necessary and to be repaid as soon as possible. Not surprisingly, the longest ayat in the Quran is on that. And that is what I said. All right? Thank you.
So that's a great question. How do you remain steadfast to that destiny? The challenge would be what we in economics or psychology they call the prisoner's dilemma. That when you reach that dominant stage, the bank who makes the first move may actually lose market share. In the sense that now they have to go back to 100% reserve. How would they keep growing their loan book and make the loan more affordable and what we call grow their market share further. This is where you have to play a role as Sharia scholars, because by that time, if the dominant position has been taken by the Islamic banks, you have this external checks and balance. But the Sharia scholars can say, look, we no longer would support this unless you move to this reform. So the shareholders are forcing that upon us now. 10 years ago, I don't think we were looking at how much of this particular financing is going to impact the environment. There was no ESG consideration at that point in time. As long as it meets the ROE target, we will extend the financing. But today the shareholders are demanding. So why can't the shareholders and the Sharia scholars make sure that we keep the course? So that's where I think your role can, be significant in making sure that once we reach that dominant market share, we are able to actually implement. But the most important thing is, bankers need the guidance from the academia. They must come up with a robust proposal that is in line with Islamic finance principles, that once the market is ready, it has got a good proposal that could be rolled out in a span of 3 or 5 years once you are ready to reform the banking system.
Thank you. Is there, I'm not seeing any coming through online. Would it pop up? Nothing online here? Okay. Can I get a question from this side of the room? If there's one, no? Okay. Oh, yes, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Mukhtar, nice to see you again after 30 years. Just a quick question. I want to challenge you that actually we do have market share. Because if you take the prices of fossil fuels and you take the commodity of fuel, we control the liability side very strongly. So why can't we use that as a market share accelerator to produce a capital risk-based model?
Good to see you too, Shad. Look, I think one of the great dilemmas that you look at the industry is, if you look at the footprint of the Muslim world and the resources that it has in terms of, population size, education, access to the carbon space throughout the world. In theory, we have many of the component parts of a financial ecosystem. And yet the irony for some of us who've worked in the Middle East is, if you go along to the Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds and offer them an opportunity to invest Islamically relative to conventionally, 99% of their capital is in the conventional markets. And even over the last 20 years, the quantum shift of that capital into anything that borders on Sharia compliant investing, it's occurred, but it's still very modest by scale. So I think the answer, Shahid, is that different parts of the universe remain unconnected. The fact that the Muslim world produces a lot of income from the sale of hydrocarbons doesn't translate into those organizations, whether they be sovereign wealth funds or governments, actually pushing that money into Islamic finance. What we have seen is that they have increasingly looked at the Islamic debt capital markets. So a number of them, as you well know, have issued sukuks. A number of them have got sustainability frameworks. A number of them are more open towards it now than they've ever been before. But has it got scalability? Not yet. And therein lies the opportunity. I think that, part of the rationale that Rafi and I argue for is that, look, we've got to have products and propositions to put in front of them to say, look, if you do this, this is incrementally of value to you. If you go back to the sovereign sukuk example of Malaysia, actually the Malaysians were very brave in 2002 when that sovereign sukuk was issued to recognize that actually if issued it in a sukuk format, they would end up finding liquidity from both conventional and Islamic investors. And that's what that story proved. So you've got to have some faith that we can put propositions forward that shape some of those capital flows more in the direction of Islamic finance than before. But we shouldn't just assume, as often I've been reminded, that just because we're Islamic doesn't mean we have a natural preference to invest Islamically. It's got to be based on returns that we're able to accept and returns that are comparable to what's being offered in the conventional universe.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more. Safri, did you want to have the final question?
Sure. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and very good afternoon. Just so honored and flattered to be on this, in this session, listening to the distinguished panelists on this panel for the last 1 hour. So I think maybe a round of applause once again to all the panelists here. So I think my question basically is an accumulation of feedback that we've received from Dr. Ala, Brother Mukhtar, and Brother Rafi, right? I mean, Rafi, you spoke about this market share, right? So having been doing this for almost 3 decades now, we noticed that there is a challenge, right? You mentioned about this 40% market share that Malaysia has accumulated, and we saw that in the Middle East as well. And I'm still not convinced that Islamic finance is in control. Maybe Islamic finance in Malaysia is in control. Maybe Islamic finance in the Middle East is in control. But to say that Islamic finance globally is in control of its own destiny is still, the jury is still out there with regard to that. So my question is actually on the market share, right? I mean, when it comes to market share, I think Tan Sri mentioned this morning we are at 3.7 trillion, right, versus 400 trillion. So we're not even 2% of the global market. So how do we convince, right? And also going back to what Brother Dawood said earlier, how do we convince these developed countries? If we put every single country on the atlas, right, there are only about 20 countries embracing Islamic finance, either fully or half-heartedly. So how do we convince these other guys, the so-called the G20s, ex-Indonesia, ex-Turkey, to look at Islamic finance, ethical finance, sustainable finance in a more serious manner, right? Because now we are on this we're not even embracing the full reserve banking. So when one talks about full reserve banking, we have to talk about asset management. We have to talk about, you mentioned about Sukuk. What about the treasury business? What about the other business apart from the deposit business? So how do we convince these guys to look at Islamic finance, on a more serious manner, right? And I'm talking about a long-term play from comments from a couple of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Safri. I think if you look at the market share, I was contextualizing to each country. So if Malaysia is able to get 60-70% market share, and it has a robust proposal, it can start working on the implementation of the full reserve banking. But unless the whole world changes to full reserve banking, it will be very difficult to get efficiency, because the fractional reserve banking creates short-term efficiency in terms of pricing. Because you're able to get debt at a cheaper price, therefore you'll be able to sell your products cheaper. But in the long term, there would be severe shocks and cost to the system. And net, you're worse off, because you are socializing the losses and privatizing the profits. So this is what has been continuing for 500 years. So the point you made earlier is, if we are not able to get market share, I strongly believe the market will collapse anyway. So if you look at history, it may not repeat, but it rhymes. So you saw the COVID in this century, you saw the plague in the previous century, and so on. Another Great Depression is likely to happen. The last one happened in 1930s. This one probably will happen before the 2030. So if you are ready with the proposal and you know how to implement it, I think you would have a voice in the world. And hopefully the world will work together to change the system. And that's what I'm saying. Seek cooperation with Positive Money, with the Roosevelt Institute, the Shoemaker Institute. All these institutes are really keen to transform. It's up to us to be part of this movement, and hopefully we can collectively change the way banking is done.
Thank you. Yep.
I want you to just think about this, right? The irony in a very Malaysian context, right? So the process, right? So riba, that's your ultimate sin after syirik. If you're in Malaysia and you walk into a 4D shop, orang Islam haram masuk. You go into the supermarket, okay? This is the non-halal section. Yesterday, controversy about the non-halal lift. How come on the bank we don't slap a sign, haram untuk orang Islam? Why? This is what I keep saying, right? If you read the Quran, you have to ask, why does Allah declare a war? Because this thing about riba, right, and all of its manifestations has got something that truly corrupts the soul. And the step out of it is simple. Allah just says, stop. Right? So for all the bankers in here who sit on the conventional side, stop. Because the penalty for not stopping is hell forever. Right? I mean, think about how graphically Allah paints it in the Quran. So we got to ask ourselves, the Christians lost the battle, the Jews lost the battle, the Hindus lost the battle, even in the Buddhist scripture you cannot do it. But we still do it. So this is not just a problem of logic. This is not just a problem of market share. This is a problem of yakin. There is a certain way that Allah has created this world, and He has given us rules. And before He gave us the rules, He gave it to the Christians, and He gave it to the Jews, and He gave it to Moses, and He gave it to David. We're the last man standing. To quote the words of N54, Islam is the last man standing. They are either going to save the world or they're going to destroy it altogether. Because every other religion on this subject has already capitulated. So that was my last, Imran.
Thank you very much. I think that's all we have time for. Now it's time to vote. So if you could all get your phones out, and if I could get them to scan your QR code there on Slido, and please vote for the motion. Islamic finance needs a radical change to live up to expectations. Radical change or gradual change? I feel I should be commenting like a horse race, if that was halal. Well, it looks like the radical change guys gradual change is clawing back some market share, but it's really struggling. All right, I think there you have it. Radical change at 67% and gradual change at 33%. Can I just have a big round of applause for the amazing speakers, the four amazing speakers. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Abim. Thank you very much to Ratna, Oz for organising their amazing teams. Thank you for Bank Negara and the Securities Commission. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa